So you're interested in trying out some macro photography? Well, you've come to the right place. I'm Ben and this is Adaptalux, and we specialize in macro photography and close-up, abstract, artistic types of photography right here on the channel and in our company where we sell all kinds of macro photography equipment. So we're going to be running you through everything that you might need and everything that you might need to consider when you're starting macro photography. We're going everywhere from equipment through to techniques and any other tips and tricks that you might need that might be a little bit different to other types of photography that you may already be familiar with. So whether you're wanting to go out for a walk in the woods and capture some mushrooms, or you want to be shooting at home and try some artistic, abstract images, I've got you covered. Stick around and we'll get started in just a sec. So let's start off at the very basics. What is macro photography? The trick is in that word macro. Macro means big, and that might be a little bit confusing because we're shooting something that is really small. But we're actually referring to the process of making that small subject much bigger onto the camera sensor. So it's the opposite of regular photography, where you might be taking a picture of a landscape or perhaps a person, and that image has to be downsized onto the size of your camera sensor. With macro photography, we're doing the opposite. We're making that small object much bigger. Now, there's a lot of factors that go into the ratio of how big your subject is compared to your camera sensor, including the size of the sensor itself and the type of lens you're using, and of course the size of the subject. We're going to be talking about all of that in just a moment, but that is your basic explanation of macro photography, making something small, bigger to fit onto your camera sensor. First of all, we need to take a look at some of the equipment that you're going to need. You need at least a macro lens, but there's a different way to go about this depending on how much you want to spend and, of course, your objectives. Let's start at the very basics. We get asked quite often, can I do macro photography on my phone? And the answer is, of course, yes, especially if you have a modern phone like the iPhone 15 Pro Max. I think that's what it's called, but it has a macro lens built in, so you can just hit macro mode and be able to get that super magnification. It's going to get you really, really close, and you'll be able to get those cool macro shots to a limited degree on your phone. If your phone is a little bit older perhaps, and you don't have that macro mode or a macro lens built into your phone, you can get something like a clip-on phone macro lens. Now these just clip onto your phone over one of your existing lenses, and then that lens will get a lot more magnification. It's pretty cool, it's pretty handy to have one of these in your pocket, and it's a really cheap way to try out macro photography. This is an item that we have on our website for those people that are wanting to just try out a little bit of macro photography, or perhaps just need an extra little bit of magnification on their phone. Check these out, I'll link them down in the description. They say that the best camera is the one that you have with you. So a phone is really convenient for taking it out and about. It's always going to be in your pocket. And if you have a clip-on macro lens as well, then you can do your macro photography whenever the mood strikes. However, if you're a little bit more serious about your photography already and you want to get a better quality image than your phone can provide, then you maybe already have a dedicated camera. However, you might not have a dedicated macro lens. But before you go out and buy an expensive macro lens just for trying out macro photography, well, there is an intermediate solution there. You can use your standard kit lens, or perhaps you've got a zoom lens or a portraiture lens, and you can convert it into a macro lens for trying out macro. This is the Raynox DCR250. It's a clip-on macro lens converter. So I've got my 28mm lens just here, and onto the front of that I can clip this Raynox lens. Now that's going to straight away give me a lot more magnification on this lens. Now 28mm is probably not ideal, that's really wide, so we're only going to narrow it a little bit. But if you've got, say, a 50mm lens or a 100mm lens or anything in between there, clipping on one of these DCR250s onto the front of your lens will effectively turn it into a macro lens. Interestingly, you can also clip this onto the front of a macro lens to get more magnification. Now this is much cheaper than buying a dedicated macro lens, so this is definitely something to consider. Again, we have these on our website and they're really handy. You can put them in your pocket and take out a lightweight camera with only a single lens and still be able to do macro when the mood strikes. Perhaps you've moved past point and shoot and phone cameras and you've invested in a mirrorless or a DSLR camera, in which case you're going to be able to change the lenses on the front of your camera depending on the technique and the situation that you're photographing. That means that we can invest in a dedicated macro lens. Now, pretty much every lens and camera manufacturer is going to have their own range of macro lenses. They will range in magnification and they will range quite greatly in price. There's a few factors that you're going to need to look at for your macro lens. Firstly, you want to look at the magnification ratio. For example, on this 25mm f2.8 ultra macro lens from Laowa, we have a 2.5 to 1 ratio up to a 5 to 1 ratio. That means that this thing has a 5 times magnification at its maximum. Now that is really quite close, so you might want to look for a lens that's got maybe a 1 to 1 ratio or a 2 to 1 ratio. That'll soften the learning curve a little bit. If you're going straight in at a 5 times macro lens, it's going to be pretty tricky to get to grips with all of the differences between regular photography and macro photography. However, that's not to say that it's impossible, and you need to look for what you are interested in doing. If you want to get really close straight off the bat, then yes, it's going to be a little bit challenging, but you're going to have the lens capable of doing that. The other factor when choosing a macro lens is going to be your working distance. Working distance is the distance between the front of your lens and the subject. It's not really a factor in other types of photography because that distance is quite far. You're usually going to be several meters away from your subject at the very least. However, with macro, you can be as little as a couple of millimeters away from the front of your subject, and that can introduce problems as well. So a longer working distance is usually much better for macro photographers. It means that you can fit lights and other objects in between the subject and your lens. It means that you don't have to disturb your subject by getting really close, and especially if you're wanting to capture insects, you want to not get close enough to spook them and have them run away. So you're looking for a macro lens that has the magnification that you're looking for, and you're also considering your working distance. Now, of course, lenses have all sorts of other qualities as well, including the speed of the lens and perhaps the autofocus capabilities of your lens, which you would usually be prioritizing for normal types of photography. A lot of people that like to shoot in the dark will prioritize how low your f number can go to get as much light into the camera as possible. Other people will want to focus really quickly on your subject. People doing motorsport and things like that will want fast autofocus for tracking. However, those two qualities are not necessarily as important for macro photography, so don't go spending thousands just to get a lower f-stop on your camera. Don't go spending thousands for autofocus. I would say generally you're going to be focusing manually, and generally you're going to be adding light into your images anyway, so you don't necessarily need that really low f number. Let's talk very briefly about your choice of camera. Now, it doesn't really matter what make or model of camera you've got. Some of them have better features, some of them have more megapixels. That's generally irrelevant if you're just starting out. What you may want to pay attention to, though, is the size of the sensor. Now, generally, when you're getting up to the enthusiast and pro level cameras, people start talking about a full frame camera. It's generally considered better for most types of photography. However, macro photography, you may want to think about using your crop sensor camera. The size of the sensor does make a difference when it comes to macro photography. The effect of your lens is going to be much more pronounced on a smaller sensor. The lens has to do less work to make that small object bigger. It only has to make it medium sized rather than bigger for a full frame sensor. So if you've got a full frame camera, it's not the end of the world. You may just find yourself cropping down a little bit to get the same effect as the crop sensor. That might be offset by more detail and more megapixels in a full frame camera, but I'll leave that up to you. Do your research, find out how many megapixels you're getting on your full frame camera and whether or not it's worth possibly the extra price that you'll pay for it. Now, cameras and lenses are not the end of the line when it comes to equipment for macro photography. In fact, I'd argue that they're probably the easy part. There's other things that you're going to need depending on the type of macro photography that you're going to be doing. And yes, there are different types, different specialties, all within this specialty of macro photography. I, for instance, like to photograph at home. I like to set up on a table and take my time to create a scene in front of the camera, to light it and to explore all of the detail on inanimate objects, or perhaps creating abstract art using unconventional means. Now, you might want to be going out and about into the woods, taking photographs in the undergrowth, maybe some insects or something like that, and that's absolutely fine as well. They just require slightly different supplementary equipment. Let's start off with some of the more basic stuff, like tripods and subject holders. Stability is a big factor in macro photography. Every little movement that you make, every movement of your camera and every movement of your subject is going to have a much greater effect on your image than you're perhaps used to. As you're using bigger magnification, shaking hands is going to translate to much bigger movements in your image and perhaps a lot of camera shake. So you might want to use some faster shutter speeds, but more importantly, try to reduce as much movement as possible in the first place. This is why I recommend having a good quality tripod. Now, using tripods is obviously more suited to that type of photography where you're shooting at home and you are constructing an image in front of the camera. However, even if you're going out and about, I'd recommend having access to a good quality tripod. Perhaps your insects are being patient and it might be worth setting up on a tripod and having that really stable shot. I also recommend having a tripod that has a good quality ball head attachment on the top. The ball head is a type of attachment that allows your camera to move freely in all directions. So it's this piece just here, and I'm able to lock this camera off in any angle that I wish, and that just gives me a little bit more versatility in my compositions while attached to a tripod. The final factor when it comes to stability is the stability of your subject, especially if you're shooting outside. Too much wind or too much movement in your insect is going to cause you some problems. Not only are you going to have to follow that action, follow the insect as it crawls around, you're also going to have to use a much faster shutter speed to try and reduce all of that movement. If you're shooting indoors like I like to do, we have something called the macro subject holder. This is a fancy piece of kit that has these flexible arms with crocodile clips on the end of them that allows me to place my subjects down in a position that I like. So it might be worthwhile to have something like that if you're planning on setting up some still life scenes, perhaps shooting some flowers. You need a way to hold them steady in front of the camera. This also adds to the ability to recompose your image without having to move your camera. A lot of the time when you're doing still life, it's much easier to manipulate the subject itself than it is to change the camera and the angle when you're already set up on a tripod. Now, lastly, for our equipment considerations, we need to talk about lighting. Now, perhaps if you're just starting out with photography, you've not delved into the realm of artificial lighting yet. You've just been using the light from your window or the sun. Now, macro photography is going to change this a little bit. One of the notoriously difficult things with macro photography is getting enough light into your image. This is affected by that magnification and your working distance. If you have a narrow working distance on your lens, you're perhaps going to be causing shadows. You're going to struggle to get enough light down onto your subject. It's also exacerbated by the fact that we may need a higher shutter speed than we're used to reduce any movement in the subject. So we might need a lot more light on our subject. And this is where some dedicated macro lighting equipment can really come in handy. Now, this is what we specialize in. We have the Adaptalux Studio, which is a miniature lighting studio for macro photography. It's specifically designed to aid macro photographers in getting light down onto a small subject. There's another advantage to having something like this, especially if you're using continuous LED lights. LED lights are on all of the time, which means every small change you make to your lighting and to your subject is going to be reflected on the back of the camera immediately. That means you can place lights around, you can diffuse them, you can change their colors and their intensities, and all of that will be immediately apparent on the back of your camera, and you'll see what your image looks like with every little change. That's a fantastic learning tool, especially if you're not used to using artificial light. Now, there is an advantage to using flash as well. We have flash lighting arms that use the same control pod, they plug in and bend around in the same way, but these are designed to freeze motion. So when I talked about stability being an important factor, there is a way to freeze that stability when you're hand holding, and that's by using flash. The duration of a flash is really quick, so you can use even a relatively slow shutter speed and still be able to freeze the motion of insects. In fact, there's some quite specialist types of macro photography that rely upon flash. Things like water drops colliding in mid-air can be captured by using the short duration of flash lighting. I would probably argue that flash is one of the most important factors when it comes to starting out with macro photography. If you're not learning with light, then you're not really learning photography. Photography is the manipulation and capture of light after all, so introducing light into your macro photography is going to give you a much better image. Now, if that long list of equipment is a little bit daunting and you're not sure what to go for, well, we have you covered, at least for some of it. So our lighting is available on our website. You can also get the little mini tripod to hold your lighting, and we have a dedicated pack that includes a setup just like this one, along with that DCR250, the Raynox clip-on lens that I mentioned earlier on. So if you're just thinking about trying out macro photography, you don't want to invest thousands into a dedicated macro lens just yet, well, for just a few £100 or a few $100, you can get a clip-on lens that will fit to your existing lens, your kit lens, or perhaps you have a zoom lens. This will clip right on there, and then you also have that LED lighting, which is fantastic for experimenting and learning macro photography as you go. I'll link to the macro photography introductory kit down in the description and up in the top right hand corner. I seriously recommend going to check that out if you're really looking to get into macro photography or just try it out at a relatively low cost. So you've got your camera, your macro lens, your lighting, and your other equipment ready to go, and it's time to start doing some macro photography. So let's talk briefly about some settings, techniques, and other considerations that you need to think about as you start shooting. The first of which is, what are you going to photograph? Now, there is a big difference between macro photography and regular types of photography in that generally when you're setting out to do normal photography, you have an idea of what you want to photograph. I want to photograph a landscape, so I need a camera, a landscape lens, and a nice landscape. I want to photograph a car, so I need a nice lens, I need a nice camera, some lighting perhaps, and a car. But when it comes to macro photography, you need your camera, your macro lens, some lighting, and a macro subject, which could be just about anything. Now, this is a whole part of the joy of macro photography, is exploring the world around you. You can clip on your macro lens onto your phone or onto your camera and go exploring in your own home or out in the woods or just wherever you are. Every single item around us looks completely different when you get up close. So there really is no answer to what do you photograph first, it's only what takes your fancy. If you do need a little bit of inspiration though, we have hundreds of videos right here on the Adaptalux YouTube channel that cover pretty much every cool macro subject going. And if you find one that we don't know about, make sure to put that in the comments, because we will cover it in detail and show you exactly what you need to be doing to get the most out of your macro photography with any particular subject. So once you finish this video, explore some of our other videos. We've got flowers, we've got abstract shots, we've got toys, and we've got just about everything. So do check out our other videos if you need that little boost of inspiration or a few ideas to get you started. Let's talk about the different approaches and methods of macro photography. I can boil these down to a couple of different styles. My style usually is to shoot at home. I like to set everything up on a table or in a studio and have control over my environment. What I mean by that is controlling the amount of light, ambient light in my room, controlling vibrations, controlling my subject. I can place my camera exactly where I need it to be, I can place my lighting where I need it to be, and I can take my time to manipulate my subject and change my settings for the perfect shot. This really lends itself to macro photography because it is quite a precise pursuit. However, there is another approach that you can take, and that is going out in the wilderness. Instead of building a scene in front of your camera, you can go out and find that scene how it really is in real life. This is where you see a lot of images of insects and plants surrounded by foliage. Those are generally taken out in the woods. However, it does require a different approach. It's perhaps no less meticulous, but it is a little bit more fast-paced. You're going to have to think on your feet when it comes to your settings and your lighting, and if in particular you're shooting insects, you're going to have to be very quick off the mark to get your shot. Whichever approach you take is up to you, but you might need to replace a few things here or there, like changing LED lighting for flash lighting if you're going out in the wilderness to freeze the motion of your camera or of the subject, or perhaps shooting on a tripod if you're inside and doing away with the tripod if you want to be a little bit more mobile. I'll leave all of those considerations for you to think about and try out yourself, but they are things that you will need to think about as you're starting out with your macro. The next hurdle that you'll come up against is your camera settings, and in particular, your exposure values. Exposure works in the same way as it does in normal photography. You're either shooting on auto or choosing your 3 exposure values: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. However, I do need to bring to the forefront of your mind aperture. Aperture is particularly important for macro photography, and it should be your primary setting, the one that you're changing. So if you're shooting on a shutter priority a lot of the time to make sure that you don't have any camera shake, you might want to consider shooting on aperture priority for macro photography, or better yet, full manual mode, so that you have full control over all 3 of your settings. Aperture is important for a particular reason, and that is your depth of field. Depth of field is how much of your image is in focus at once. This isn't where you focus your image, it's how much of your subject looks sharp compared to the rest of your image. The setting that changes your depth of field is aperture. As you change from, say, f2.8 up to f22, you'll see a drastic improvement in how much of your image is in focus at once. But this is counterintuitive to getting a lot of light in your image. We've already talked about how difficult it is to get enough light for a macro shot, and this is primarily because you'll have to be shooting on much larger f numbers than you're perhaps used to. Even up to f22, you're still going to be getting quite a shallow depth of field at high magnifications, so you'll need a lot of extra light to compensate for that. What I mean by all of this is that you need to be thinking primarily about your aperture. How much of your image do you want to be in focus? That's the primary factor when it comes to macro photography. You can then change your other settings to compensate or sacrifice to keep everything nice and bright looking, but that is a particularly important thing to note if you've never shot at high magnification before. The next thing you'll have to think about is your focus. It's usually not something that you have to think about because autofocus systems these days are really good and really fast. So if you're shooting, say, cars or people, it will find the right place in your image to focus on, and that depth of field will compensate for any inaccuracies. However, when it comes to macro photography, choosing the spot for your very thin slice of in-focus area is going to be a lot more tricky, and a lot of autofocus systems will simply trip themselves up and focus in the wrong place, leaving your image looking a bit strange or guiding the eye to the parts of the image that you really didn't care about, and leaving out that part that was really really interesting. This is why I recommend always using manual focus. Trust me, you're going to want to choose exactly where in your image is the most in focus. There's a lot of detail to be had when you get up close like this, and it's really hard sometimes to choose which part of that detail you want to focus in on, and it's even harder for your camera to choose for you. So I do recommend switching your lens to manual focus if it has that option, or just getting used to always focusing manually by moving your camera forward and back, or by adjusting your lens. There's one last setting that I wanted to bring attention to that can be really handy for macro photography, and in particular manual focusing. This is for people with a relatively modern camera like my mirrorless Sony here. It's got settings that are particularly helpful if you're trying to find a very precise focus point. The first one is called the focus magnifier. It essentially just zooms all the way into your image for you, and you can choose exactly where in your image is in focus. You can double check, triple check that the point of focus is absolutely right. So find that the camera setting in the back of your menus and make sure it's nice and handy to zoom all the way in and double check your focus. The next one is a little bit more obvious. It's called focus peaking. This is an overlay in the back of your camera that will tell you which parts of your image are the most in focus. It usually shows up as a red or a yellow silhouette around the parts of your image that are the most sharp. This can be really handy, especially if you're using manual focus. It's another good way to check that the parts of the image that you want to show off are the ones in focus. It is something that can get in the way though, because it will cover up a little bit of that detail, but the simple act of taking the photograph will see that all of that detail is still there and it is just an overlay. Check out those two settings in the back of your camera if you have them, because they are really handy, especially if you're using manual focus. I think I've covered everything that there is to think about when you're starting out with macro photography, but macro photography is a pretty huge genre of photography, and there are subgenres along the way, so there are a lot of things that you can explore and invest your time into. If you've been left with more questions than answers, do make sure to put those down in the comment section, and I'm sure the pros amongst us will be happy to help out with any additional information and tips that they have as well. If you do want to get more involved in the macro community, then I will link down in the description to the Adaptalux Macro Photography community group on Facebook. It's a place where we go to share all of our macro shots and, well, show off a little bit when we get something particularly cool, ask for tips when we need some help, and generally chat to each other about all things macro. Go over and join the group, comment and say hello, and if you need more information, more inspiration, make sure to hit the subscribe button right here on the Adaptalux YouTube channel, because we have a huge volume of tutorials, ideas and inspiration just waiting for you to explore. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, make sure to hit the like button. But for now, that is all I've got time for. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.